Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Husted. I am the program manager at the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. We'd like to thank you for joining us today. We have a very exciting program for you presented by Stuart Anderson. It's Influence and Cooperation, How British and US Pharmacopoeias Shaped Each Other 1720 through 1990. Stuart Anderson is Emeritus Professor in the History of Pharmacy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he was previously Associate Dean of Studies. He has been researching and written about the history of pharmacy for over 30 years. He was the editor of Making Medicines, A Brief History of Pharmacy and Pharmaceuticals, and now edits the international journal Pharmaceutical Historian. His recent books include Pharmacy and Professionalization in the British Empire, 1780 to 1970, and Pharmacopoeias, Drug Regulation and Empires, Making Medicines Official in Britain's Imperial World, 1618 through 1968. He is currently completing a 4-volume collection of primary source material on the history of 19th century British pharmacy and pharmaceuticals for Routledge, and is preparing a new book on pharmacy, medicines, and religion. He is a recipient of the Leslie Matthews Medal, the Schellens Plaquette, and the George Erdong Medal, and a fellow of both the Royal Pharmaceutical Society and the Royal Historical Society. Sorry, Stuart, I seem to have butchered one of your medals or awards. But thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And welcome, everybody. Greetings from sunny London, where it's just after 6 p.m. at the moment. So good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you're joining us from today. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you. When Greg approached me and said, could I speak about my work on official pharmacopoeias, that's those issued under the authority of a state or a medical body or some other authority, he said he'd be very interested in anything I could say about the relationship between British and American pharmacopoeias. Well, of course, a great deal has now been written about the histories of both, and his suggestion prompted me to revisit them and to explore the links between the two. And I'm very conscious that much of the work on the early British pharmacopoeias was actually done by American historians, notably George Erdang on the London Pharmacopoeia and David Cowan on the Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia. And of course, a lot's been written about the USP, particularly aware of the work that Glenn Sonnedecker did. It was published in Pharmacy and History, and of course, Greg's more recent book on it as well. Right, we'll try and move these slides forward. Bit of a delay here, I think. Amazing, isn't it? Oh, here we go. Excellent, we got there in the end. Okay, well, connections between British and American pharmacopoeias go back a long way. They were extensive and they're related to both process and to content. Pharmacopoeia bodies have a difficult job to do. They have to decide how to achieve consensus about what should be included in the national pharmacopoeia and the extent to which pharmacists should be involved, if at all. Should its content be based on earlier works? To what extent should it incorporate local and indigenous medicines? How should they deal with those items excluded from the pharmacopoeia? So in this talk, I want to explore US-British interactions relating to official pharmacopoeias. And they included the exchange of drafts and texts, transatlantic visits, and influences which extended beyond national boundaries. And as we shall see, a number of themes run through much of this narrative, including issues of national identity, the quest for national unity, along with relations both between groups of doctors and between doctors and pharmacists. We should begin, however, with an important observation, and that is that the first edition of the United States Pharmacopoeia, the USP, was published in 1820, 44 years before the first edition of the British Pharmacopoeia, the BP, was published in 1864. Both had antecedents, of course. In 1820, there were in fact 3 official pharmacopoeias in use in Britain and its empire. But the United Kingdom was then a union of 4 countries. Wales had become part of the Kingdom of England through Acts of Parliament in 1535 and 1542. 160 years later, Scotland joined England and Wales to form Great Britain in 1707. And in 1800, Ireland joined the others to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, an arrangement that existed until 1922, when Ireland was divided, giving us the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland that we have today. Well, the 3 distinct pharmacopoeias for England, Scotland and Ireland emerged at different times and reflected differences in national identity, in medical politics, and in local traditions. The London College of Physicians were the first to take action. The London Pharmacopoeia appearing in 1618. There were in fact 2 editions of this published in May and December that year, and we're grateful to George Erdang for his scholarly analysis of them. It was reprinted at intervals when supplies ran out, and it was written in Latin. But in 1649, an unlicensed apothecary, Nicholas Culpeper, translated it into English, adding his own scathing comments about the physicians who'd compiled it. Well, in the early 18th century, American editions began to appear of works that had been published in England. These included an American reprint of Culpeper's translation of the London Pharmacopoeia, which was published in Boston in 1720. David Cowan tells us that this was not only the first full-length medical work published in the colonies, but also the first work of a pharmacopoeial or dispensatory nature in America. Well, in the British Isles, the London Pharmacopoeia was the sole official pharmacopoeia for virtually the whole of the 17th century. But in 1699, it was joined by the first edition of the Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia. The London Pharmacopoeia was then up to its 3rd edition, published in 1677. The Edinburgh physicians were very aware of plans for union between Scotland and England, and they were conscious that without a pharmacopoeia of their own, there was a very good chance that the London one would be imposed upon them. Scotland then became part of Great Britain in 1707, 8 years after the Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia was published. Well, things had moved on quite a lot since the London Pharmacopoeia had first appeared. There'd been new discoveries in medicine, and Galenic medicine, based on humoral theory, was challenged by Paracelsian ideas emphasizing greater use of elements and metals. The Edinburgh physicians were keen to set their pharmacopoeia apart from the London one. So Scottish items were favoured over English ones, and instead of juices, the plants themselves were included. And a popular London compound, Theriaca londinensis, which had been included in a 1685 draft of the Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia, but it was excluded from the final edition. Well, physicians in Dublin viewed the 1707 union between England and Scotland with considerable alarm. A college of physicians had been founded in Dublin in 1654, and the need for a pharmacopoeia was first discussed in 1717. Initially, the Dublin physicians adopted the London one, but the prospect of union with Great Britain prompted renewed effort to compile their own. And with the end of the American Revolutionary War, which had disrupted activities in Ireland, a committee was appointed to prepare a Dublin Pharmacopoeia. A specimen copy was circulated in 1794, 6 years before union with Britain, and a revised version appeared in 1805, and the first public full edition was published in 1807. While being published long after both the London and Edinburgh Pharmacopoeias created a number of problems for the Dublin Pharmacopoeia, and these were spelled out in its preface. Medicines are prepared sometimes according to the London formulae, sometimes according to the Edinburgh, and not infrequently at the mere discretion of the apothecary. Some practitioners, awaiting further directions from the college, continue to use the nomenclature of the 1746 London Pharmacopoeia. Some adhere to the latter publication, and not a few prescribe according to one of the multitude editions of the Edinburgh College. And it was a situation no doubt repeated in many of the American colonies. Well, across the British Empire, the situation was even worse. The impact of the pharmacopoeias abroad was largely due to where physicians had trained. Many of those who settled in British colonies had been trained in Edinburgh, and they were familiar, of course, with the Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia. And this became the basis of much pharmacy practice in many parts of the British world. But increasing numbers of Irish physicians and apothecaries also now established themselves overseas, and they, of course, used the Dublin Pharmacopoeia rather than one of the others. By 1809, a 7th edition of the London Pharmacopoeia had been published, with a revised version appearing in 1815. And by 1817, Edinburgh had issued its 10th edition. The Dublin Pharmacopoeia, 1807, helpfully included an index giving the names of the drugs used in each of all 3 pharmacopoeias. And there were many differences. Dispensing prescriptions in the colonies was usually a considerable challenge. Well, then Solidecker tells us that the earliest drug treatise in America by a colonist was Thomas Harwood's Electorum Novum, published in Boston in 1732. Harwood's book clearly drew on the London Pharmacopoeia, but it took war with Britain for an American pharmacopoeia to appear. And this, of course, was the Littitz Pharmacopoeia, the military formulary which appeared in 1778. And it was described as a formulary of simple yet efficacious remedies for use of the military hospital. And its most important source was the 1756 Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia, official when the Littitz's author, William Brown, was himself studying in Edinburgh. But other sources included the Pharmacopoeia of the Royal Hospital of Edinburgh, the 1746 London Pharmacopoeia, and the Pharmacopoeia of a Jewish hospital in London. Step towards a United States Pharmacopoeia was that taken by John Morgan, who in 1787 proposed to the College of Physicians of Philadelphia the compilation and publication of a pharmacopoeia. After the federal constitution was ratified a year later, the plan was expanded, and in 1789 a circular was sent to all other states there were 22, I think, at the time, pointing out the need to standardize drug use and prepare a pharmacopoeia to prevent that uncertainty and irregularity which in our present situation must infallibly attend on the composition of the apothecary and the prescription of the physician. And it also asked recipients to tell them what Native American remedies have been discovered amongst you. Well, it would be another 30 years before the first USP appeared. Several states had considered producing one. In 1805, the Massachusetts Medical Society appointed a committee to compile a volume to be called the Massachusetts Pharmacopoeia. The society had resolved to adopt the Pharmacopoeia of the Edinburgh College as its own, but it made such omissions, alterations, and additions, which included indigenous American drugs, as it saw fit. And this was published in 1808, and it listed 536 drugs and preparations over 272 pages. It was a large volume. And this was subsequently adopted by the Medical Society of New Hampshire, although the Medical Society of South Carolina refused to adopt it, stating that a perfect pharmacopoeia can only be obtained by the concurrence of different states. Well, in the absence of such a work, several American hospitals developed their own formularies, and in 1816, the New York Hospital published its own pharmacopoeia. But finally, in 1817, Lyman Spalding proposed to the New York County Medical Society that a national pharmacopoeia be compiled and published under the authority of all the medical societies and medical schools in the United States. A convention would be called in each of the 4 grand divisions of the United States. Each district would compile a pharmacopoeia and elect delegates to meet in general convention, and the convention would then form a national work from the 4 district ones. Well, if such consensus could be achieved, this arrangement would clearly avoid repeating the situation that existed in the United Kingdom with its 3 national pharmacopoeias, which was clearly also causing problems in the UK. In the UK, doctors moved freely between England, Scotland, and Ireland, and many, of course, went off to the colonies. And in 1810, the London College of Physicians noted that the Scottish element amongst medical men practicing in England grew, and as a result, the anomaly of having independent standards for the 2 countries became more evident. So in 1813, it was proposed that an imperial British pharmacopoeia be considered. But this motion was lost, although the idea persisted inside and outside the college. Well, the London, Edinburgh, and Dublin physicians were fiercely protective of their individual pharmacopoeias. As expressions of national identity, they conveyed a certain equality of status between the 3 royal colleges. Before 1820, little effort was made to unify them, but with publication of the USP, a first move was made by the London physicians. They began by approaching the Edinburgh physicians. They readily agreed, and the Dublin College was then asked if they would collaborate in compiling a pharmacopoeia for the United Kingdom. But the Dublin Fellows were divided. The task was considered to be too difficult due to the great distances involved, and negotiations were abandoned. Well, no attempt was then made to merge the London and Edinburgh pharmacopoeias. Relations between the different colleges were strained. The Edinburgh physicians noted the exclusive spirit of which the London College of Physicians and the Society of Apothecaries guarded the monopolies conferred upon them by their charters. The London College, it thought, remained determinedly elitist, whilst the Edinburgh College itself was much more pragmatic. The colleges continued revising their individual pharmacopoeias, and harmony was delayed for another 30 years. In the 1840s, the focus in Britain of all three Royal Colleges was medical reform. Although the plan for a national pharmacopoeia for the United States avoided the risk of ending up with 4 divisional pharmacopoeias, was clearly a very great achievement. Although in the event, in fact, only the northern and middle divisions submitted drafts. Spalding had devised a very democratic process, and delegates put national interests before partisan ones. The Massachusetts delegate had ambitions for national recognition of their pharmacopoeia, but he was willing to speak not as a Massachusetts man, but as an American, and to merge their efforts with others to achieve national consensus. For a new country, a pharmacopoeia was a clear expression of national unity, although its actual appearance owed much to the London one. Spalding himself wanted it to be after the manner of the last London pharmacopoeia, although Glenn Sonnedacker has subsequently suggested that a more obvious model was Richard Powell's 1815 translation of it. Well, comparing the two, the USP and the early British pharmacopoeias, there are clear similarities and differences between them. First of all, both were written in Latin, but the USP gave the English translation on the facing page, whilst in Britain, separate translations followed separate books sometimes afterwards. Neither chose to specify doses or therapeutic indications. But the USP separated materia medica into 2 groups, primary and secondary lists. This was an important innovation, the secondary ones being judged of less certain efficacy. In Britain, there was a single list of materia medica, and in specifying weights and measures, the USP designated liquid quantities by measure, in line with London and Dublin, but not Edinburgh, which specified liquid quantities by weight. And this resulted in many errors in the strengths of the medicines, as no account was taken of specific gravity. Formulations were drawn from all 3 pharmacopoeias. Well, if American physicians had learned something from their British colleagues, the converse was not always true. Apothecaries and chemists and druggists played virtually no role in the compilation of the early pharmacopoeias. Even when the physicians sought their advice, it was usually ignored. The 3 Royal Colleges of Physicians continued to battle for dominant positions in the ongoing review of medical reform, including attempts to control the chemists and druggists, who finally came together to found the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain in 1841. Well, by that year, the USP was up to its 3rd revision, by which time some important shifts were taking place in the role of pharmacists in compiling it. In the 1st revision, in 1831, a few members of the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, founded 10 years earlier in 1821, had cooperated with the physicians. In the 1842 2nd revision, advice was offered by the Boston and New York pharmacy colleges, but the Philadelphia College went further and submitted a full revision of the whole pharmacopoeia. This was accepted by the physicians, and by 1851, the 1851 third division, US pharmacists were given full representation on the General Convention. They were being treated as full partners. And in 1880, a pharmacist was appointed as chairman of the Committee of Revision for the first time. A great difference from UK, as we shall see. And it was a lesson that the British physicians had failed to learn and continued to learn, in fact, right up to the late 1920s. The future of pharmacopoeias in the United Kingdom was closely tied to medical reform, which finally came with the 1858 Medical Act, which placed the practice of medicine in the hands of a new overarching body, the General Medical Council, the GMC, on which would sit representatives of all three Royal Colleges of Medicine, of physicians. The Act tasked the GMC with appointing a Pharmacopoeia committee, and of causing to be published a new publication to be known as the British Pharmacopoeia. Well, with the creation of the GMC, the balance of power in medicine shifted. The dominance of the Royal College of Physicians, quote, decidedly reduced when its sole representative had to take his seat amongst the rest. The council had 9 representatives nominated by medical bodies, 8 by universities, and 6 by the Crown to oversee it. All were doctors, and amongst them was Robert Christison, an Edinburgh physician who'd published detailed commentaries on the Pharmacopoeias in 1848. Well, although the Act gave the GMC the task of producing a GMP, it did not give it authority to replace the existing ones. So a second Medical Act has to be passed, directing that the BP shall be deemed to be substituted throughout Great Britain and Ireland for the 3 earlier ones. Establishing a Pharmacopoeia committee was one of the GMC's first acts. It drew on the experience of the 3 colleges and consulted medical and pharmaceutical bodies. At its first meeting, it agreed to communicate with the Pharmaceutical Society to request their cooperation. While Jacob Bell, its founder, was delighted. He wrote, "It could not have been other than gratifying to the Pharmaceutical Society to find that it was placed in so prominent and honourable a position by the Medical Council." But his enthusiasm was short-lived. The earlier proposal for an Imperial British Pharmacopoeia drew interest from the US. Franklin Back, a physician and professor of chemistry who taught at Jefferson Medical College and the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, had collaborated with Dr. George B. Wood in publishing the US Dispensatory in 1833. And in 1855, he declared that the US Pharmacopoeia could not be expected entirely to supersede the British Pharmacopoeias and include the whole of the Materia Medica and preparations of the British standards. There would, he suggested, be many advantages for both English and American pharmacy by adopting a single pharmacopoeia for the British Empire. Well, by 1860, the USP had been in existence for 40 years, and by then George Wood had been a member of the Committee of Revision for 30 years and its chairman for 20, and he remained on it until 1879. And he was also president of the convention between 1850 and 1870. But Wood was the first USP chairman to represent the USP abroad. And in the 1860s, he travelled to London twice to meet with members of the Royal College of Physicians. And he would certainly have met with this gentleman, its then president, Sir Thomas Watson. Although by then, of course, the GMC, not the London College of Physicians, was responsible for producing the Pharmacopoeia. The college seat at the table was occupied by Dr. George Burroughs, but his voice was now one of 24. It's probable that Watson bemoaned the creation of the GMC and that body, rather than the college, was now responsible for producing the British Pharmacopoeia. And we can suppose that Wood shared his experience of revising the USP, including treating pharmacists as partners. But he also spoke with those tasked with compiling the BP, as he tried, unsuccessfully at that point, to get them to agree to a common system of weights and measures. And he took a set of proofs of the first BP back with him to the US. Well, despite Wood's undoubted best advice, the first edition of the BP was not well received by the medical profession in Britain when it was published in 1864. A fate which, of course, had fallen the USP when it was published in 1820. It no longer contained many of the preparations that doctors were used to prescribing, and it was found to be full of errors. The London physicians had not been able to control either the method of its compilation or its content, and they raised many objections, including to proposed changes to the system of weights and measures. Watson denounced it as dangerous and not to be used. And following its poor reception, work began immediately on a second edition, which was published in 1867. But its reception across the British Empire was even worse than it was at home. It did not reflect medicine use outside the UK. In India, a Bengal pharmacopoeia had been in use since 1844. And as soon as the BP appeared in 1864, work began on a pharmacopoeia for the whole of India. And the Pharmacopoeia of India was finally published in 1868. And this, in fact, borrowed an idea from the USP with its separate primary and secondary lists of materia medica. For it divided drugs into official drugs, those listed in the BP, and non-official drugs, which were those of proven value and in regular use in India, but not listed in the BP. But when the third edition of the BP was published in 1885, some Indian drugs were added, and the BP was deemed to be sufficient for the needs of India, and the Pharmacopoeia of India was withdrawn. Well, repeated demands were made for its reinstatement and continued, in fact, until Indian independence in 1947. Doctors in India lobbied hard, and in 1892, the Secretary of State for India, the Earl of Kimberley, asked the GMC to investigate how the BP could be better fitted to the needs of India and the colonies. And the result was an empire-wide consultation with medical and other authorities across the 70 colonies, and the submission of a large number of suggestions for items to be included in an imperial pharmacopoeia. The outcome at that stage was the production of an addendum, the Indian and Colonial Addendum, which was published in 1900. Well, the addendum was a slim volume, just 59 pages. It contained 54 drugs and 65 preparations. And most of them were just for use in India and the eastern colonies. Variations to formulations were allowed to take account of climate. The proportion of alcohol could be adjusted to help preserve preparations, and the base of ointments could be changed to prevent them liquefying. But religious sensitivities had been overlooked. Hog's lard was an ingredient of some preparations, whilst others included beef suet. but pork products were forbidden to Muslims and the cow was sacred to Hindus. So an amended versions had to be issued for India in 1901. Well, work began on the next edition of the BP in the early 1900s. When the 5th edition was published on the eve of the First World War, it was described as suitable for the whole empire. And after the war, in the early 1920s, work began on the next edition. But by then, there was widespread concern about both the content of the Pharmacopoeia and the way in which it was compiled. For the last few editions, virtually all the work had been done by pharmacists, with the General Medical Council Committee acting as little more than a rubber stamp. Medical school teachers complained that the Pharmacopoeia was edited on fundamentally wrong principles. Others, that advice given was totally ignored. When the GMC approached the Pharmaceutical Society for its help, the Society declined, saying that they would only be prepared to help if they were given a seat on the Pharmacopoeia Committee. But this was declined, and without pharmacists' help, work on the new edition ceased. And the dispute between the two professions could only be resolved by a Committee of Enquiry appointed by the Privy Council. Well, in 1926, a committee was appointed to make inquiries, to collect information, to receive evidence, and to make recommendations on the question of whether it is desirable to make alterations to the existing law or practice relating to the preparation or publication of the BP and to its adaptation to the requirements of the British Empire. It was very broad-ranging. Hugh Patterson Macmillan, a lawyer and a member of the Privy Council, was appointed as its chairman. And it had only 5 other members. 3 were doctors, and the others were Sir Henry Dale, a pharmacologist, and a civil servant acted as his secretary. The committee's search for evidence was extensive. It obtained information about the methods used in preparing the national pharmacopoeias of the United States and 9 European countries. And between December 1926 and April 1927, 21 witnesses gave evidence in person. One of them was an American. E. Fullerton Cook had been a member of the USP Committee of Revision since 1920, and he'd recently been appointed its chairman. He gave evidence on the history and organisation of the USP. Cook, in fact, spent a whole year in Europe, meeting with representatives of pharmaceutical bodies. His evidence was highly influential. We had the advantage of hearing from Professor Fullerton Wood, Macmillan reported, a very full and interesting account of the American system. And we had before us the last issue of the USP, which contains an account of the constitution and procedure of the convention and its committees. Now, in its evidence to the inquiry, Canada had proposed setting up a large body representing all parts of the empire. The model in view, declared Macmillan, is that of the USP Convention. But he was not convinced it could work in the UK. However well adapted that system may be to the necessities of a single, though extensive country like the US, we are satisfied that it would not be suitable in the case of the British Empire. Much greater distances separate the various parts, and we have received neither from India nor any other dominion any suggestion in favour of an imperial convention. The idea of a representative convention on US lines was quietly dropped. Well, the committee made a total of 8 main recommendations. The first, that the GMC should establish a new body to be called the Pharmacopoeia Commission. Its membership would consist of people representing all the departments of knowledge and experience. A selection committee would consist of 4 people nominated by the GMC, 3 by the Pharmaceutical Societies of Great Britain, Ireland, and Northern Ireland, which would be established from 1922, and 2 by the Medical Research Council. Pharmacy finally had a seat at the top table. The committee saw no need for a change in the law, which meant that legal responsibility remained with the GMC. And in any part of the empire which wished to make a drug official, they could do so by issuing a supplement or addendum to the BP. And India and the Dominions were asked to establish their own pharmacopoeia committees to advise the BP Commission in London. Well, the Macmillan Committee's recommendations were accepted in full, and work began immediately on the next edition of the BP. Its guiding principle was that it would contain only those standard articles which were in general use throughout the empire. The 6th edition was published in 1932. Local drugs and substitutes would be covered by local supplements and addenda, and further work on the BP itself would be published as regular addenda. Selective consultations were held with the empire, and the commission received comments from committees in India and certain of the dominions. But as the influence of the empire beyond the dominions diminished, that of international bodies, and particularly the USP Commission of Revision, increased. The issues that both the British and US authorities had to face was what to do about unofficial preparations, those in regular use but not included in the pharmacopoeias themselves. In Britain, one of the initiatives was taken by a pharmacist, William Martindale, with the assistance of a doctor and coroner, Wynne Westcott. In 1883, they published the Extra Pharmacopoeia of unofficial drugs and chemical and pharmaceutical preparations. They noted in their preface that 16 years had elapsed since publication of the last BP, and during this time a number of new drugs have been introduced, many official ones have been put to new uses, and a number of non-official preparations have been employed in pharmacy. It included a number of USP preparations, and it was immediately successful. By 1885, it had already reached its 4th edition, and by 1902, its 10th, and it remains an essential drug reference today. Well, in the US, the first edition of the National Formulary of Unofficial Preparations appeared in 1888, 5 years after Martindale in the UK. But it was published under the authority of the American Pharmaceutical Association, founded in 1852, 11 years after the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain. And the formally recognised that the remedies for which the Pharmacopoeia prescribes definite standards constitute only a limited portion of the resources of the medical profession in the treatment of the sick. Publication of Martindale, of the National Formulary and of the US Dispensatory acknowledged the pharmacopoeias could not include everything, and that extra pharmacopoeias and dispensatories such as these provided a means of dealing with a wider range of topics. But Martindale's extra pharmacopoeia lacked the official endorsement by either a medical or pharmacy body. But noting the success of the American Pharmaceutical Association with its national formulary, the Pharmaceutical Society took its own action, and in 1907 launched a new publication. the British Pharmaceutical Codex, which was described as an imperial dispensatory for the use of medical practitioners and pharmacists. This is the BPC, and it was issued under the authority of its council. Well, this had a much broader scope than the BP, as it covers all drugs, medicines, and excipients in common use throughout the empire. And it included medicines listed in the pharmacopoeias of France, Germany, and the USP, along with dosage forms not listed in the BP. Well, there were a number of issues that were common to both the US and British authorities. And one of them that both had to deal with was patents for new drugs. In 1934, the GMC agreed to exclude items that were subject to patents or trademarks, except where multiple licenses to manufacture had been granted. But this was soon reversed. In 1937, they allowed the inclusion of substances for which the only practical method of preparation was protected by patent. This included things such as sulfanilamide. But the issue arose again during the war, when the USP agreed that products covered by patents or trademarks could be included, the question of therapeutic value only being considered. In May 1943, the GMC agreed that the BP Commission need not consider its choice limited by actual or potential rights in manufacture. Well, when copies of USP 12 were received in 1942, the BP Commission noted that it included a lot of new monographs. In fact, there were 47 new tablet formulations, several capsules, and 19 injections. With the end of the war, BP Commission set out their plans for the next edition of the BP. As usual, they consulted authorities across the empire, and they received a large number of suggestions. They approved 580 monographs, and they sent proofs with the list of the proposed additions and deletions to expert committees, including the USP Committee of Revision. This exchange of information was designed to keep the two pharmacopoeias in as close agreement as possible. The Commission reported that it had derived much assistance in its work from the cordial and active cooperation of the USP Committee of Revision. Substantial harmony in titles and standards had reportedly been achieved. Well, American willingness to assist may have been at least in part motivated by the large number of American drug companies then establishing subsidiaries in the UK. The first to manufacture in Britain were Park Davis, and they were followed by Abbott, Lederle, MSD, and a host of others. And cooperation between the BP Commission and the USP Convention continued over the decades. In the 1968 BP, which is the last to be produced by the BP Commission, before it became the Medicines Commission, the Commission again noted the cordial relations that had been maintained with the United States, but this time along with the Nordic Pharmacopoeia Council and the World Health Organization. Well, exchanges between the BP and USP staff were in both directions. In 1992, Dr. Robin Hutton, who was then the Commission's scientific director, visited the USP in Rockville to study how they produced monographs. And he noted that analytical development work carried out by the BP was not done by the USP. BP staff spent much of their time checking analytical test methods submitted by manufacturers to make sure they were robust so that they could be used by other laboratories. But the USP largely accepted analytical methods submitted to it and usually published them unchanged. They relied on feedback from other users and FDA laboratories to identify any needing improvements. But the BP later adopted an approach similar to that used by the USP after consulting drug companies about what help they could provide. And this significantly increased the number of monographs that could be published. Well, financial issues were also a regular theme of exchange between the USP and BP staff. Macmillan had recommended that the BP should be funded by the GMC, who would receive the proceeds of its sale. Much later, in 1977, the BP Commission chairman, Cecil Johnson, noted that the USP had turned the supply of reference substances into a profitable business, but he felt that this was not feasible for the BP. The issue came up again in 1990, when it was noted that the USP was the only self-financing pharmacopoeia, and that a substantial part of its revenue came from the sale of reference substances. But the BP policy of minimizing reliance on the use of reference standards remained. While the USP had an influence that extended beyond the UK itself to parts of the British Empire, and this was greatest in Canada, where pharmacy was shaped as much by French and American texts as British ones. Indeed, efforts were made by Britain to align Canadian practice with that of the United States. When the Indian and colonial addendum was prepared in 1900, the GMC announced that an endeavour will be made to secure harmony of treatment between the Canadian portion of the addendum and the United States Pharmacopoeia. And the USP later secured a place in Canadian drug legislation. Its 1909 Patent and Proprietary Medicines Act defined patent medicines by their absence from official publications, which included the PP, the Codex of France, and the USP. Well, similar references to the USP are to be found in the legislation of other dominions and colonies. In Australia, the USP was cited in legislation in 1923. In naming items not listed in the regulations, the instruction was to set out the name most commonly applied to the substance in the English language, in the Pharmacopoeias of Great Britain and the United States, or in the British Pharmaceutical Codex or other recognised authority. A 1956 survey on the legal status of the BP across the empire also revealed the number of references to the USP. Singapore, for example, reported that medicines which do not disclose their composition or active ingredients in specific terms or by reference to the BP, BPC or USP are prohibited imports under its customs ordinance. But if lessons learnt by the British and American authorities from each other were not always acted upon, they were often completely ignored when newly independent countries developed their own. A Drugs Enquiry Committee in India in 1932 had sought opinions on whether doctors favoured compiling their own Indian pharmacopoeia or adopting that of Britain, the United States, or some other one. Well, the overwhelming view was that India should have its own, but this was again denied by the British authorities, although an Indian pharmaceutical list was prepared in 1946 on the eve of independence. And on independence itself, in 1947, India wasted no time in developing its own pharmacopoeia. But procedures used in compiling the British and American pharmacopoeias were largely ignored. In appointing members to its Pharmacopoeia Committee in 1948, the Indian Ministry of Health selected people on the basis of the positions they held rather than on their expertise. It was chaired by the Director General of Health Services. And furthermore, the clash of medical and pharmacy roles that had caused problems in both the UK and the US was in danger of being repeated in India. The government planned to place publication of the Pharmacopoeia under the control of the Indian Medical Council. The Indian Pharmaceutical Association objected, and the Indian Pharmacopoeia was eventually made a joint responsibility of the Indian Medical Council and the Pharmacy Council of India. So what can we conclude from this brief review? Well, it's clear that the influence of one country's pharmacopoeia on the other ebbed and flowed over the years, and it extended to both the processes used to compile pharmacopoeias and to their content. In spelling out the democratic process to be used, Spalding was able to avoid repeating in the US many of the problems that Britain had with its London, Edinburgh and Dublin pharmacopoeias. American chairmen of committees of revision offered their advice to the British authorities in good faith, although, as we've seen, sometimes it was ignored or at least declined. And whilst the content of the first USP can be linked to the Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia, later editions of the USP and the BP strongly influenced each other. British physicians ignored the experience of their American colleagues in many ways, not least in the need to treat pharmacists as their partners. Pharmacist representation on the BP Commission lagged far behind that on the USP Committee of Revision, but it did grow with each revision in the middle of the 20th century. By 1948, 3 of its 10 members were pharmacists, and the final BP Commission in 1968 had 13 members, 6 of whom were pharmacists. The BP had finally become a collaborative effort with a wide range of experts working together. So the relationship between the USP and the BP has been one of influence, cooperation, and collaboration. And long may it continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. We are now going to have time for a question and answer session.